Last week, we built a kind of basic data app using Python, running that Python in our tool called Hex to show some data about the 2024 Olympics. What we're going to do in this session is continue to build on that app that we started last week and make it a little more interesting, a little bit more complex. So this is what our final result will look like. So we're going to add in some data about the 2026 Olympics since those just wrapped up. We're going to talk about adding some visual components like this heat map, which is a pretty cool feature of Hex, but also similar data visualization tools like Tableau or Power BI that you might find out in the world. And then we're going to add some more complex text components, some comparative value components. So we'll kind of like build on this project that we had last week. So for those of you who are, or I guess 2 weeks ago, because of the holiday. So for those of you who were here last time, if you still have your project from last time in your Hex account, you can actually just pop that open and continue to build on that this week. If you were running into any issues in the previous session, or if you had any errors from your last one, you can also go in and copy. I basically made a copy of everything we did last week that you can start from as a template again. That is called Spring 2026 Python Part 2. If you go under projects in Hex. Same thing, you can hit the ... icon and hit duplicate and make your very own copy. So if you were here last time, you can keep working on yours, or if you want to start clean or you had any issues, you can copy this template. And then if you're joining us just today, you should definitely copy this template. Let me show you what that looks like in here. So you should see projects on the left-hand side. If you don't see Spring 2026 Python Part 2, in the middle, hit projects, it should pop up for you. When you see this, you should hit your ... and then duplicate, all right? ... and then duplicate, and this will make your own copy. This is your own private copy. You can add as many bits of code, text, whatever you want in here. And you should just name it something so you know that it's yours. So for example, I will name this Rachel's copy. Check this out. This is the one that I will use for today. So I want to start with a quick review of what we covered last time while everyone's making sure you have a copy and all that. So if we switch at the top from our notebook view over to our app view, we can see the app that we built in our last session together. The first time you open a Hex project, you're probably going to need to hit this pink Run All button at the top just to make sure all those bits of code have run and updated, all of that. You see now it updated a little bit of placeholder code there. So you always want to hit Run All when you open a new project. But this is where we left our data app from last time. So the components we added were a drop-down menu that lets us select which country we want to see Olympics results from 2024 from. We added a little header that then dynamically fills in whichever country we've selected here. So this header will update based on me changing the drop-down menu up here. I'll think for a second. We added a couple of single value components. So this first one is going to tell us how many athletes were competing in the Olympics from that country. And then we also took the average age of the athletes who won medals from this country. All right, so all of this is dynamically updating from our drop-down menu. We added a details table down here. So this will show us the names, the sports, and what medal the medalists from this country won. And to display this little medal icon here, we used a function that we wrote, that we defined, that translated between the phrase gold medal to the gold medal. Actually, I guess Argentina doesn't have any gold medals in this view. To the gold medal emoji, same for silver, same for bronze. So just like a little trick to make our detail view a little bit more visual. And then the very last thing we added was sort of I call this like a dynamic summary or a data summary. So this is a chunk of text where we're dynamically filling in different values based on what country is selected. So again, just how many athletes from this country won medals, how many total medalists were there at the Olympics, what percent of all the medalists came from the country. Okay, so this is the data app that we built last time. So again, you can either use your copy or start from this template if you want to start fresh. And we are going to turn this app into this app. All right, so we're going to add some cool interactive map components. We're still going to keep our filter. We're still going to keep some of our existing components. We're going to add some additional data sources like our 2026 Olympic data. We're going to add some more complex dynamic text components where we're actually going to calculate what sport each country had the most medalists in and display that. We're going to do some comparative elements between 2024 and 2026. and keep all our components from last time. Any questions about what we're going to do as our project for today? Okay, great. Anyone have any trouble copying the project? Everyone's got a template to work from. Any issues with Hex? Feeling okay. Okay, great. All right. We just talked through all of our components, make sure I don't forget anything. Okay, so we're just essentially going to add a bunch more components today. So this will be a bunch of hands-on keyboard time, probably even more so than our last session, right? So we're going to add, I think, a total of 5 or 6 more components to our data app. First thing that we're going to add is this more complex text component right here. So our goal with this component is to say, you know, especially for countries that won a lot of medals, this is a lot of information to sort through to see sort of which sports did this country medal the most in. We want to know what country or what sport they medaled the most in general. And then specifically, if they had any gold medalists, what were most of those gold medalists competing in? All right. So that is the component that we are going to work on today. First, so we'll use this one as a little bit of a review of some of our concepts from last time. As a reminder, for all this code that we're about to run, you're going to want to switch back to your notebook view in the top of Hex here. And if this is your one from last week or the template, I've left all of our code from last week copied in here. All right, so you're going to need to scroll down quite a ways past all of this logic and exercises that we did last time. For example, here's our little function that defines our different types of medals and how we want to visualize those. All right. So you're going to want to scroll down past all this stuff and add more cells that we're going to work on today down here at the bottom. Anywhere, you can add a cell sort of anywhere in the document if you'd like to add them elsewhere, but anywhere that you hover, things getting in the way, anywhere that you hover and see this little plus sign in your Hex project is where you can add a cell. All right, today we're mostly going to be adding Python cells. Also going to be adding some markdown cells for more text. And then we will add some visualization cells also when we get to the maps part, which we'll do at the end. Okay, so I'm coming all the way down to the bottom of my project. I'm going to add a new Python cell. And let's refresh a little bit on some of the concepts that we figured out last time. So the main concept that underlies our whole dynamic dashboard that we have so far, or our data app, is this idea that the user selects a country, right? And then everything else updates accordingly. So when the user picks a country, we've saved that value to this variable selected country. And then we're going to use that throughout our app specifically to filter our data and also to just like display that country's name. So for our text data component, where we're going to display the top sports for each country, we're going to start by filtering our data set by that country. All right, so this should look familiar if you were here last time. I'm going to take this chunk of code, which is saying take our medalist data frame. So that's our data set that contains one row for each person who won a medal at the Olympics. And then filter that data set by anytime that column country, so anytime the medalist country equals the selected country variable. So whatever has been selected in the dropdown, filter this data frame by that and give us that list. So I'm going to take this little chunk of code, paste it into a new Python cell right here. And then I'm going to hit run, which is this little play button on the right-hand side of my Python cell, or you can also hit Command Enter on your keyboard. When you do that, you'll get a little preview of the data as it's filtered down. All right, so you'll see that in the country column here, these are all Argentinian athletes. So that's looking good. Seems like my filter is working. All right, since Argentina is the country I currently have selected. All right, so again, anytime that we're filtering a data frame, we're going to give that data frame name, square brackets, and then sort of whatever criteria we're filtering that data frame by. And in this case, that's just the column country, which we refer to here with the column name in quotes. And then equals equals, 2 equal signs is checking for if it's true. All right, remember that we use 1 equal sign to assign a variable. So here we got to use 2 to indicate that we're doing logic check for equality. And then we're looking at our selected country variable. All right, so we've done our first step, which is filtering our medalist data back down by our selected country. Okay, next up, we want to group that country's medals by discipline. Okay, so that I want to continue manipulating this data frame that I've created, I'm going to actually save this filter data frame that I've made to a new data frame or variable value. To do that, I am going to come in here just as we did last time. I might give it a name like this, country medalist. Let's make sure I haven't already used that name elsewhere. To do that, I'm going to check into my data frames under my data browser icon on the left-hand side. This is where I can see all of the data frames that already exist in my project. All right, great. So I'm going to set country medalist equal to this filtered view that I've made. And then I can see immediately in the left-hand side here in my data browser, country medalist gets added to that list. I can see that it has 19 rows, and I can see those columns that are included in that data frame listed out here. All right, excellent. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to group this data frame. So I'm going to do some summarizing because I want to know how many medals total were brought home by athletes from this country. So I'm going to use this function .groupBy. When we use .groupBy, we want to tell it which column we want to group our data by. So if I come and look in my data set here, I'm going to look at my columns from my data browser. The column for discipline is the one that's going to tell me the sport. I could also double check that by coming up to our display view we added last time, and it looks like discipline is the more useful field to use. This like event detail is sort of like a subcategory of discipline, but it's not that helpful because sometimes it just says women, and that's not really like a helpful field for determining what a sport is. Okay, so we're going to use this field discipline. So I'm going to add a .groupBy. All right, I'm going to group by discipline. And then I'm going to add a group or a sort of metric for size. Size meaning how many rows are in this grouped setup. Take this guy, I'm going to run this. Okay, great. And this is going to give me just a quick preview. Now, this preview is going to show me the name of the discipline and then the number of medalists from that discipline. All right, so it looks like Argentina has medalists in 3 different sports from 2024, which is pretty cool. All right, but this, you can see just from the preview here that this data isn't totally formatted. This isn't exactly how we're going to be able to access it in our dynamic text component that we want to add. So we're going to do a couple other things. We want, first of all, to just grab the very top sport. Right, so for Argentina here, in our example, we want our dashboard to say Argentina won the most medals in hockey, right? We don't actually want to list all the sports in this case, we just want to pull out the top one. So I essentially want to take the maximum of this list, right? I want to like sort it descending and take that max. So to do that, I am going to add a function called .max. Show you what that looks like. So again, I'm just tacking that on to the end of my little code fragment here. And I'm going to run that. Okay, now the reason that I run this, so this returns the value 16. Now there were 16 medalists in the sport hockey, which is great, but I actually don't need this number for the component I want to create, right? If we go back and look at this component, I actually want like the word hockey to appear here, not the number of medals. So .max is like kind of conceptually what I need, but not exactly the right field. Okay. So what I actually want is the ID associated with that field, which is a slightly different function called .idxmax. All right, I want to show you both because there's different situations where you would use either one, right? You could imagine you could make a dashboard component that says Argentina's won 16 medals. That could be a component that we add to our app. But we have decided for our purposes that we actually don't want it, the number 16, we want the word hockey. So when I switch our .max function here to our .idxmax, I actually get hockey returned to me. This is also the reason why I like to do this in a step-by-step way, right? So if I just go back to where I had done group by and then size, I can see here with my eyeballs that I would expect the result to be hockey. Right, so then when I add that little IDXmax function back in, I can sort of check that the answer is correct, right? I'm expecting this to return hockey. If it returned something else, then I would know that this was not the right function that I needed to use, right? So you want to think through what your expected result is, actually run your code and make sure it sort of matches what you expect. Okay, very good. Next thing we want to do is save this value to a variable. Always want to give your variable a descriptive name. So I might label this something like top discipline. And again, in Python, your variable name can't have any spaces. And typically the convention is to use an underscore between words. Okay, so top underscore discipline. And then a single equal sign means it'll assign whatever value is on the right-hand side to this variable. Anytime you want to use that value, you can just refer to it as that variable. And then Hex is going to do a little handy thing for me. It's going to pop up that name of that variable underneath my cell. That's how I'll know that that variable is ready to be used in any cell further down. All right, last thing that we're going to do here is display this value. Okay, the way that we're going to do that is in Markdown, same way that we did the header of this project. All right, so I've written out some Markdown here for you, which you can just copy paste. All right, I'm going to take this little chunk of Markdown, I come back into my app, add a new cell Markdown this time instead of Python. I'm going to paste in that little Markdown template and make sure my variable name matches. So I used a top discipline. You can label your variable whatever you like, as long as that makes sense. So I'm going to paste in that little chunk of Markdown, and then I'm going to hit run or command enter. As soon as I hit run, this part of the Markdown will stay the same because this is like the code part. And this is our little visual preview. So this part should then update to Argentina or whatever country you have selected, and hockey or whatever sport came in the top. All right. Yes.
What did the two asterisks do? Is that bolding or doing something else?
Yep, exactly. So Markdown is like a kind of behind the scenes formatting thing. So if I take out our asterisks, it becomes not bold anymore. So yeah, Markdown is like a pretty common little like formatting language that you can use in a whole bunch of different apps. But yes, the two asterisks are just making it bold. And then same here, the three sort of pound signs, hashtags, whatever, are making it to a bigger font size header. All right, I will fix this. Okay, great. Okay, I will take a quick pause here. Any questions? Anyone get any error messages with anything that we ran? Feeling okay? Did everyone get a sport name returned here in this component? Okay, great. All right, and then the very last thing we're going to do, which is sort of the workflow that we'll follow a bunch of times today, same workflow we followed last week, is we'll write a bunch of code, kind of figure it out. Once we get to our final cell that displays our data or our component exactly how we want it to appear in our finished data app, you're going to add it to your app builder. You're going to hit this little kind of looks like a little quilt, little rectangle icon over on the right-hand side of your cell. It'll say add to app builder. It'll light up in pink. And then when you toggle over to your app, it will add this cell probably in some random place on your page layout. And then from here, you can drag and drop however you like. We're going to add a bunch of components today, so I'm not going to do a ton of drag and drop right now, but I can take it and add it, down below if I wanted to, whatever is most convenient for me. And then always a good idea when you're adding a new component to your app to try your dynamic filter again and just make sure this updates correctly. So I'm going to change it from Argentina to, let's say, Australia. I'll see if my little loading icon in the upper right will let me know that things are running. And if it hits any errors, the upper right will also have a little red warning message for me. Looks like it all ran successfully, or it might be running something still down below, but this part ran, which says Australia had the most medalists in swimming. So both of these values changed, right? My country name and my sport value label. So it looks like our component is working. Cool. All right. So this is a slightly more complex text component than we've done before because we're doing a little bit of manipulating of our data to actually figure out what value dynamically we want to display, right? We don't already have some table that has per country number of medals, right? So we're sort of dynamically figuring that out as we go in this case. All right. So the next component of our data app that we're going to add is very similar, but has a little nuance, which is a concept that you all should learn if you want to be doing any data app building in your future, which is called error handling. Okay, so the part that we're going to add, this is the part we just created, most total medalists and the sport name. The part we're about to add is the most gold medalists in a sport. Okay, now the reason that we need to add some error handling here is that in our medalist data set, every person, every row in that data set is a medal, right? So we know that any country we select from that list will have at least one medal, meaning there will be at least some value here. Now it is definitely possible, and in fact happens, that a country has someone who won a medal in something, but no gold medals, right? So it's possible that the answer to this could sort of be blank or nothing for an individual country that we filter by. So we need to account for that case. That's called error handling. And that's what I want to demonstrate to you with this very similar component. All right, so we are going to create another Python cell where we are going to define this variable top golds discipline instead of top discipline. All right, so those numbers should be less than or equal to our total number of metals, right? Because you can't have more gold medals than total medals. So you're gonna want to create a variable with this name. So I'm gonna pop back over to my project, toggle back over to my notebook view in the top, coming down here and add a Python cell. All right, and I'm gonna set an equal sign, and I want you all to take a stab at filling in what should go on the right-hand side of this equal sign, how we should define this variable. And this is gonna be very similar to how we defined our previous variable, top discipline, but we need to filter by only our gold medals. All right, it's the same thing we did with top discipline, but we need to only filter by our gold medals. All right, we've done a bunch of filtering. We did one filter at the beginning of class. We've done a bunch of filters if you scroll further up and look at part 1 from last session. All right, so we need to sort of combine those two concepts, filtering our data frame and then doing this group by size IDX max situation. I have a little hint for you in the tutorial if you're really stuck, but I would encourage you to just take a minute. I'm going to give you all a couple minutes to look at that piece of code, scroll up and look at where we filtered our data frame before, right? For example, when we made our country medalist data frame, and think about how you would combine these two concepts to filter by the type of medal. Okay, so I'm going to give you all a couple minutes. If you're totally stuck, raise your hand, and we'll reconvene. All right, how are we doing? Our way there? Okay. All right, so let's talk about this together a little bit. Okay. So anytime that you are going to write a piece of code that is similar to some chunk of code that you wrote before, I would recommend copy pasting that similar chunk to what you're doing and then tweaking from there. All right, so you're not starting from a blank slate. So in this case, because I told you that this variable is going to be very similar to how we define this variable, I'm actually going to start by just copy pasting this chunk down into this cell. First thing I'm going to do is a straight copy paste and just make sure that runs. Make sure I didn't like mess up the copy paste, miss a parentheses, whatever. Okay, that's always the place you want to start. Now, the two things I told you needed to combine were this variable definition, right, where we're taking that maximum value sport that comes up, sport or discipline as it's labeled here, and then we're taking the name of that, which is what we're doing with our .idx max. But I need to filter this down, right? This is going to be the top discipline for all the medalists. I want to know just about the gold medalists. So if I come back up to my previous cell up here where we did our country medalists, this is a place where we applied a filter. So this is what a filter looks like. When I'm referring to my data frame and then adding some information inside of those square brackets, that's going to tell me what to filter my data frame by. So that's the component, that square brackets component is what I want to add to my top golds discipline, all right? So again, I found a chunk of code that's similar to what I want to use. In this case, I'm just going to copy paste that chunk on down, and I'm just going to add it right here where I've got the name of my data frame with no filter, right? No square brackets after it. I'm just going to add that in. Okay. Now this filter isn't going to do anything because this data frame is already filtered by this criteria. So this filter isn't going to filter it down any further, but it's giving me the structure that I need. So the last thing I need to do is figure out what that filter should be. How do I filter for only gold medals? As you might remember from last time, a good, if you're trying to figure out a question like that, right? Like what fields do I use for something or what are those values? I like to just look at the first few rows of the data frame and get an intuition for what it's going to say. So in this case, country medalist is my data frame. I'm going to use this .head function that we've used a bunch of times before. .head will give you sort of like the head of the data frame or sort of a few sample rows, right? So in this case, I can see right away that there's this column medal type and there's this column medal code, all right? Medal type is obviously very straightforward. It says the words gold medal or silver medal. Medal code is a number, but I can tell, I can get some intuition here. I don't know what medal code 1 or 2 is, but just looking at these rows, I'm starting to gather that medal code 1 corresponds to gold, medal code 2 corresponds to silver, etc. I could scroll down a little bit or look at more rows and sort of validate that assumption for myself. So I can use either of these columns to filter by, doesn't matter which one. I might use medal code here as an example. So what I would do is then come up into my filter here and change this from country to that medal code column, right? Edit, my Zoom window out of the way. So I'm going to edit here. Instead of filtering by country again, I'm going to filter by this column named medal code. Make sure it's spelled exactly the same. Check down here exactly how it's spelled. And then what value do I want to check for there. I don't want to check for the text of the country name. That's not going to help me. I want to check for the value 1 because that's going to correspond with gold medals. If I had used this column, I could also use the text gold medals in quotes or gold medal in quotes. That would also work. Either way, in this case, I'm going to add my medal code equals. All right. Any questions about how we sort of combined our filtering and our taking the max? Okay, great. All right, so then the last thing we're going to do here is we are going to hop in and add our markdown to display this. So again, I wrote out some markdown for you in this little section right here. You can actually add this to your existing markdown cell. So I'm going to come back into my data app here, and I'm just going to add it below what I had before. Could also do it in a separate cell, totally up to you. All right, the only thing that you need to be careful of is that this markdown, whenever you're referring to a variable, you've defined that variable up earlier in your project. All right, Hex operates in a linear fashion, meaning if I put this markdown up above before I had defined that variable, it would know what to do. It would return an error because it hadn't figured out that variable. All right, so I'm going to pop that in. I'm going to run. So again, I'm hitting my run icon or Command Enter on my keyboard and see if this comes in. Now, in this case, Australia had the most medals in swimming, but also the most gold in swimming. So that's great. It looks like it's working. And this component is already in my app view. So if I toggle over to my app view, I see that it's updated with this new text showing my new variable. Okay, so far this is the same as what we've done before, but I want to show you what happens if you try to look at a country in our data app that has no gold medals. Apparently Malaysia is one of those countries in 2024, so it's not a dig against Malaysia, but for the purposes of the demo, let's try to filter by Malaysia in our app. All right, it's going to think for a second. Okay, so when I filter by Malaysia, my first few components of my app load fine, and this component doesn't load. I'm still seeing my kind of markdown placeholder brackets. And then in my upper right-hand side where the sort of icon was spinning, I'm now seeing a little error, a little red sort of triangle error sign. All right, if I click on that error, it'll tell me that a particular cell in my app had a problem, and it'll give me a little button to go to the cell. That'll just switch me back over to my notebook view, where I can see my little cell labels are here on the left-hand side. This one is labeled code 36, and I can see it's returned an error, okay? Anytime you get an error in Python, what you wanna do is scroll all the way to the bottom of it. This last sentence is always gonna tell you the most sort of helpful thing about this error. This is really helpful to know, even if you get to the point where you're using like AI, ChatGPT assistance for code. Often that code will return errors the first time you run it. So you want to be able to come down here and just get an idea of what the error is. Make sure you conceptually understand what's going on. In this case, this is saying value error. Attempt to get the argmax of an empty sequence. Now, you don't need to know exactly what this means to understand that it's trying to get something that is empty. All right, that's the concept here. Knowing what we know about our data set, right, that it's possible that a country has no gold medals conceptually, that sort of makes sense, right? We tried to filter by a country with no gold medals, so our variable that tried to display sport they have gold medals in is failing. Okay, so just to get some intuition for this error. So this is where error handling comes in. All right, the way that this works in Python, as well as a few other programming languages, we're going to use this concept called try except. Try means it's going to try to run a chunk of code, and if it works, great. It's going to just return that chunk of code and move on. If it gets an error when it tries to execute that piece of code, it's going to skip. It's going to say undo, stop, go down to my except section and run that chunk of code instead. Okay, so that's sort of the concept of what we're doing here. So it's saying it's when you know I have a piece of code that might fail, might error for whatever reason. So let's see if it works. And if it does not work, give me what should I give it in the error case? What should I give it if it doesn't work the first time? So this is the format that we're going to add. In Python, indentation is very important. So for this, we want to copy this with those indentations in it. Hop back over to our project, come down here. Okay, so now in my try section block, if you will, I have my variable definition. I need to paste my definition that I just came up with in there. So I'm going to do that, paste that on in. And then you see in my except block, I have that same variable name, that same variable definition, except what I'm just going to give it is a chunk of text. You know, it's text because it's in these double quotes. And the text is just going to say something like NA insufficient data, or it could say no gold medals, sad face, but text can say whatever you want. Once I have my try except block, I'm going to either delete or comment out my variable definition that I had before. In Python, if you put a pound symbol before your line, it's not going to execute that line. It's a comment for human readers only, no computer readers. Okay, so I'm going to make sure my variable definition is in my try block, make sure I've got my except block, and I've got this indentation. Then I'm going to run this cell again, and that is going to get rid of my error message. And then if I scroll down here to my markdown block, because when you run the cell, it's going to automatically run any downstream cells that are impacted by that change. I will see that instead of just erroring out, it returns the sport they had the most medalists in, and then it gave me this nice little NA insufficient data message because it got to the except part of the block. It tried this, it errored out, which is what we saw before, but now I've given it sort of a fail-safe for what to do in the failure case, which is just this little chunk of text. Any questions about what our try except block is doing? All right. Make sure that change went over to my app view. Perfect. All right, same result over here. And whenever I'm making a change like this, I should also go make sure that my regular case worked, right? So I should navigate back to a country that had some gold medals. Korea had some gold medals, let's see, and make sure that sport name appears here, right? And then it's not saying insufficient data for everybody. In this case, saying judo, archery, looks like that worked. All right, so this is kind of our workflow, right? We're running some code, we're testing it out, running it in bits, making some little tweaks. Once we're happy with it, we're adding it to our app, and then we're testing some filters, making sure it works, right? So this kind of workflow of like trying some stuff, testing at every stage is going to really help you as you're building out a bigger app or project. That way you won't get to the end and have a bunch of errors and sort of have no way to untangle them. So you really want to be testing, running code a whole bunch. You should be hitting that like command enter like all the time as you're working in Hex or any other code editor that you're using to make sure that what you're working on runs. All right, cool. So now we're going to get into some really fun stuff, which is adding more data to our app. This in particular is a very common thing that you're going to do if you're working on any sort of data project. And I think in particular, it's one of the strengths of Hex that it's so easy to add additional data. All right, so what we're going to do is add some data from the 2026 Olympics, since those just wrapped up. So I have a couple of data files for you. These are publicly available, but I've just dumped them in a folder to like save you that step. You're going to go to this link here. As long as you're logged in with your USC Microsoft, it should let you in there. And you're going to download a couple of CSV files. CSV files are just like a simple spreadsheet of some additional data, and we're going to add those data sets. We're going to add a couple data sets, but the first one you're going to grab is our medalist 2026 data. All right, so when you hit that link, you should get a folder view like this. Sign me out. Course. Once you're in here, you should see our specific folder, which should have a couple of CSV files. If you have any issues getting to this folder, let me know. And you want to download a copy. We'll start with our medalist data. Go ahead and download a copy of that. Once you have a copy of this file, or really any other CSV file or spreadsheet, there's a variety of kinds of data you can easily add to Hex. You're going to go back into your Hex project, and on the left-hand side, you're going to hit the files icon. You'll see that there's already some files in here because these are all the files that I had uploaded to this project as our 2024 data. So there's already some files in here. You got them just by duplicating this project, nice and easy. You can add any file you want by doing the drop files here or browse. So you're going to want to hop in there and add your medalist 2026 CSV that you downloaded from that link. So let me grab my copy and drop that in so you can see looks like. Here we go, medalist 2026. I'm going to drop that in. It's going to think and upload for a second, and then I'm going to see it in my list. So now I've got 9 files, and I've got this one I've just added. Okay. Now Hex has some really handy built-in features, that help you go from a CSV file or whatever file you've uploaded to actually manipulating that data in Python without having to worry too much about exactly how that happens. All right, so once you're in your project, you've gone to files on the left and you've grabbed that CSV file, you're gonna hit the little ... icon next to your medalist 2026. And you're gonna say copy data frame creation code, okay? Copy that code, and then we're gonna come down and pop it into a new Python cell. So I'm gonna open a Python cell, and hit Command V or Control V, whatever paste is on your computer. And it's going to paste this nice handy little chunk of code for me that's going to create a data frame called medalist underscore 2026. So again, it just auto-generated that for me from this little dot icon. I'm going to run that. This little variable is going to turn green, and then I'll see it appear in my data browser on the left-hand side. I'll see I have this new medalist 2026 data set. Now, if you scroll back up to the top of your project, just for your own curiosity, you'll see there was a chunk of code here that I kind of skipped over in part 1 so that we didn't have to talk about it at that phase. But this is the chunk of code that's loading all of our data that we used in part 1 into our data frame. So you can see this is exactly the same structure, right? It's assigning a name to that data frame. It's using this pd.read CSV, and then it's giving a file name. So pretty straightforward to the data frame name. So that's great because that's a little chunk of code you don't have to remember. Hex will just help you out with that, which is pretty awesome. All right, whenever you're adding a data frame, I always recommend that you run .head to just look at those first few rows, make sure everything looks right, you upload the right file, etc. So anytime I do this, I'm going to do a new cell and I'm going to type in the name of that data frame. It's going to help me out with some autocomplete, which is awesome. And I'm going to run .head, open close parentheses, and that's just going to spit out my first few rows for me. I'll get a chance to just eyeball this over. I'll see, for example, that it's got some bunch of skiing sports in here. So that checks my box for, is this the correct data set? Looks like it is. Any issues, questions getting our data frame to show up? Okay, great. You're going to do that with 2 other data frames real quick. Should be pretty fast. There's 2 other files in this folder. One is called Athletes 2026. One is called Code to Country. We're going to use all 3 of these in our next step. So take a minute, download each of these, upload them to a file, and then make sure you do this data frame creation code step. So you have 3 new data frames. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this along with you so that matches in my demo. All right, so when you're finished with that, you should have some chunk of code that looks like this. It can all be in one cell or it could be in multiple cells. You should have these 3 new data frames with these names: Medalist 2026, Athletes 2026, Code to Country. All right, now what we're going to do in our next component is actually add or join some data together, merge some data. Before we do that, I want to look a little bit more closely at what's going on in this data set that we added, Code to Country, because this is a little different than some of the other data sets that we have, right? In each of our other data sets, it's a row in that data set is something that we're interested in, right? An athlete, a medalist. Here, this is actually like a pretty boring data set. This data set has 2 columns, country code and country. And this basically is just telling us sort of the 3-letter code version of the country name. Not super interesting, but data files like this exist in a lot of different data projects because there's often times when you want 2 different data sources to talk to each other, but they might be formatted slightly differently. So in this case, one of our data sets has country available to us. One of our data sets has country code available to us. In order to join those data sets together, we need that glue. We need to know that, A and D is Andorra, for example, in order to be able to join those together. So we have this file, which is sometimes called a crosswalk, which is just kind of like a reference. So you could imagine this could be like zip code and state or area code and state, right? Just something where you need to be able to reference values that go together that might not all exist in one data set. This is the type of file that we're going to use. All right, so what are we going to do with this? Let's take a look at our Athletes 2026 data. So I'm going to come in here and do a .head on my new Athletes data frame. Do .head here. All right, and you're going to notice here that our Athletes 2026 data set does not have a column for country. It only has country code. All right, so it's not telling me this athlete's from Norway. It's telling me they're from NO. All right, so the way that we have set up our data app is to filter on the name of an entire country, right? So if I select Norway from my dropdown, and then I try to go filter my Athletes 2026 data set, it's not going to have a single athlete from Norway, as that athlete would be labeled as being from NOR, the country code. So that is the problem that we are trying to solve. So I'm going to hop back over to my editor view. I used .head here, but you can always go double check your column names again in your data browser. So I could come over here, click on my name, my athletes, and then you can see your column names down here. So sort of 2 different quick ways to just see what your columns are. All right, so let's just try doing what I said, filtering this data frame by our selected country, just so you can see what's happening. All right, so let me try just filtering the way we filtered before. Athletes 2026 country by selected country. I get this big scary error. As I said before, when you get an error in Python, you always want to scroll all the way down to the bottom. That's going to be the simplest version of what's wrong. This says key error country. Key error means it was looking for country somewhere and it didn't find it. Right, so this is one, let's say you hadn't checked your column names before and I just try running this. This would be a pretty simple fix. You'd come look at your column names and realize there's no labeled country. All right, so what we're going to do to solve this is for each athlete, we're basically going to add a column that has the full name of their country. And we're going to do that by referencing our code to country data frame. So this boring data set that just has that 3-letter code and the country name. All right, so to do this, we are going to run a function called merge. So I wrote this one out for you since this is the first time we're using this. And I will explain what this means. All right, so I'm gonna get rid of my one that's causing an error. Okay, it's a little smaller. So what I'm gonna do here is add in our code to country data frame to help us fill in that country name. So let me run this without a variable first. Okay, great. So pd.merge is the name of my function. PD is our pandas abbreviation. That's our library in Python that gives us all these data frame functions, commonly abbreviated as PD. All right, and our merge function takes in 4 different inputs. Its first 2 inputs are 2 data frames. So it's going to say, which 2 data frames do you want to merge or join together? In this case, I want to add some information to my athletes 2026 data frame from my code to country data frame. Okay, so those are the 2 data frames I'm going to give it. There's this concept of a data frame being on the left and the right. So if you just like look at how they're written here, this athletes one is on the left, my code to country is on the right. So that's my left and right data frames. All right, so you could imagine if you had 2 printed out spreadsheets, you're basically trying to like cut some rows out of one and glue them onto the other. Okay, then you need to tell it which column it should be joining on, right? You could imagine in different data sets, maybe you have 2 data sets that have everyone's email and then some different information about those people. So you'd want to join on their email address, right? In this case, the column that we have in common between these 2 data sets is country code. So I'm going to give it on equals country code, that being the label of the column in both of my data frames. That's what it's going to use to match rows between the 2. And then the very last concept I need for my join is how it's going to join them. So I mentioned that we have our left and right data frame. Let's imagine that we have each of them as 2 printed out spreadsheets. When I'm saying I want to do a left join, what I mean is I want to print out my whole athletes data frame. I'm not going to cut it up. I'm going to take my code to country data frame. I'm going to cut out each row and I'm going to glue it onto the matching row in my athletes data frame. All right, so when I have an athlete that says NOR, I'm going to take my strip of code to country that says NOR Norway, I'm going to glue it on. And I'm going to do that for every single athlete, right? So I'm going to have to make some photocopies of that strip to glue it onto my athlete data frame every single time there's a Norwegian athlete. All right, I'm going to do that for all the countries. That concept of attaching all the data to my left-hand data frame is the idea of a left join. You could also have a right join, which is sort of the opposite. That's not as commonly used. Or other types of joins where you only are grabbing rows that exist in both of your data sets. It can get a little more complicated, but I'll leave it at that for now. That's the concept of a left join. All right, so I'm running this function. I hit run in my cell, and then I can see a little preview of my results. So I'm going to notice that my first 6 columns are the same as in my athletes 2026 data set. Those are all the same. And then there's been another column added on, which says country. And so I'm just going to check, right? Country code is NOR, Norway, ITA, Italy, right? EST, Estonia, right? These like make sense. It looks like it's matching correctly. And now I've got this country column in my 2026 data, which means now I can use my selected country from my dropdown to filter this data set. All right, so the very last thing I'm going to do here is just save this sort of updated data frame with this added column to a new data frame name. So usually when I'm adding information, I'm making my data frame name the same as it was before with a little bit of extra information. In this case, I'm just going to say with country. That's all I'm adding. Throwing that equal sign there to make sure it's assigning to that variable. My preview will go away, but I can double check it in my data browser right here. And it should have the same number of rows, right, as our other data frame, because we didn't mess with the number of rows, we just added a column. And I can see here that it has 7 columns instead of 6. All right, any questions about our merge, what we just did here? Okay, so what we want to do next is use this merged data that we've created. So what we're going to do in sort of the next section of our workshop is create a side-by-side view. So last time our data app only showed 2024 results. We're going to make some updates to it so that it's showing 2024, 2026 side by side. This is a common sort of comparison setup you might see in various data apps that you interact with. So again, our final product is going to look something like this, where we've got information from each Olympics side by side. All right, so first thing that we're going to do is make some copies of these elements. Okay, so we're going to make an element that's going to display just how many athletes there were in 2026 for that selected country. To do that, because we've already done that for 2024, I'm going to scroll back up in my app and find how we defined that for 2024. So you can scroll back up in your own. Let's see if I pop up here. All right, it looks like this is where I've defined it. So I have this variable country athlete count, and then I've used it here in this component, which is going to just display the number of athletes from that country. I'm going to do the same concept, but with my new data set. So because it's the same concept, I'm just going to copy this code and paste it into a new cell. All right, so I'm going to do a new Python cell, copy this code on down, and then I'm going to make a few tweaks. All right, first tweak that you want to make anytime we're doing a side-by-side comparison like this is to update your variable name. All right, you want to make it a different name so that this definition doesn't overwrite our previous variable. Usually what I do here is just add another underscore with an additional label. In this case, I'm just going to add underscore 2026. This is that same metric we used before, but in a new year. All right, and then on the right-hand side, the only thing I need to update, all the logic is the same. I just need to pull, instead of pulling from my 2024 athlete data, I need to pull from my new data frame that I just merged together, which was this guy, athletes 2026 with country. So if you want to avoid typos, I highly recommend a lot of copy pasting when you're doing stuff like this. So I'm going to come up to my cell we just defined here. I'm going to copy that data frame name, and I'm going to paste it in every time athletes data appears in my new variable definition down here. All right, and I'm going to hit run, make sure I didn't make any copy paste errors. And to make sure that worked, I'm going to create a cell that I can add to my app. So that's going to be another single value display cell. All right, that should be, here we go. When you're adding your cells, there's going to be an option called single value. That's the one you're going to select. You're going to hit your settings icon. We're going to give this a title. All right, I would title it something like athletes from selected country in my double curly bracket so that the name will fill in there. And then I'm going to say in 2026, right? Because I want it to show that it's different from the 2024 component I already have. All right, so I'm going to save that. I'm going to add this to my app, same icon, add to app builder, over to my app. All right, and this is where I'm going to start doing some layout. So I'm going to start moving my 2024 components over to the left-hand side and start adding my 2026 components over on the right-hand side, maybe over here. And I might add another header as well. So I'm going to maybe copy my header that I had previously. Let me go back to my notebook view, add a new header to, this is the previous header that I had. So again, I'm just going to copy this, come back down and make some new markdown, and I'm going to update this to say 2026. Maybe I'll even say Winter Olympics, add that to my, and then I'll drag that up here just to start organizing my different components. All right, cool. Next thing I'm going to do now that I've added some data is I'm going to come in and change the country, change my filter, give it a run. Okay, great. So when I change it to Ireland, for example, I see 143 athletes from Ireland in the 2024 Olympics and 4 of them in the 2026 Olympics. Cool. All right, back to my notebook view. Now I'm going to add one more kind of cool data visualization feature to my little single value component that we just created. If you hit your settings icon on that component, you'll see this option to show comparison. This is going to add a handy little built-in, how much is this value different from some other benchmark value that I want to look at. All right, so I'm going to change the type to absolute change. And I want to compare this value to the 2024 value. So I'm going to do some visual for my end user. Is this an increase or decrease from the number of athletes from last year? So the value I'm going to compare it to is my other variable that I created previously, my country athlete count. Here it is, country athlete count with no year. That's my 2024 one, since we weren't using a year label last time. And then I can add a little label to say what I should compare it to. So versus 2024, like this. All right, it'll think for a second. And now you'll notice it'll dynamically input a little number. So it's 139 fewer athletes than competed in 2024. It's doing a little red or green arrow based on whether that's up or down. It's just figuring that out for me. And then I put this little chunk of text in just to explain to my end user what that is. And if I hop back over to my app, it's in there. And if I switch to some other country, I should see that part change dynamically as well. Click here, for example. Okay, great, same deal here. So I see my athletes numbers both updated and then this little summary updated as well. So just a handy little visualization cue. It's always good to give people sort of like a red, green, are things going up, down, good, bad, etc. All right. Any questions about what we did with this component? Any errors, anything? Great. Okay, fabulous. So next on down, if we're copying our components, is our average age of medalists. So we calculated this for our 2024 data set. We would want to include it in our 2026. The complication of that, if I go back to my notebook view, if I scroll back up and go try to find where we calculated that average age, let's see, we'll come back up here. All right, so it looks like here are the cells that I'm using to calculate age. Most importantly, I'm using this column birth date in my medalist data to calculate their age. That's what we did in part 1 with our 2024 data. Now, if I go look at my 2026 medalist data, this data set has fewer columns for some reason. This data set I could find for 2026 does not include a column for birth date. So I don't actually know the birth date of these athletes. There's no column for age. Like, there's no information that I can use to figure this out. So unfortunately, we cannot add this component for 2026 with the data we currently have. Now, what's cool about Hex is, let's say in a week or two, you're Googling around, you find this data set with more complete information, right, with a column that has their birth date. It'd be super easy for you to add this component, right? You would just go into files like we did before, upload your file, load in your data frame, and then follow the same workflow we just followed, right? You would copy this logic that we used to figure out the difference between their birth date and the Olympics date, right? This is this logic that we did last time. You can sort of copy that down, use it with your new data frame from 2026, and get an average age of medalists. You could do the same comparison, right? Or the Winter Olympians tend to be younger or older than our Summer Olympians, same deal, right? So relatively straightforward, add or update data as you need to. Hoping that they'll publish some more complete data soon for this. All right, so we cannot do our average age stat, which is a bummer. Makes it a little unsymmetrical, which I personally don't like. Asymmetrical, I guess. But we can do our summary stats side by side. All right, so we're gonna follow the same workflow here for this. We're gonna go look at that definition, our markdown cell, our variables that we used in part 1 for our 2024 data. We're gonna go through and edit that same workflow. So change your variable name to 2026, refer to your 2026 data frame, make a new markdown cell to display that, and add it to your app. Okay, that's our general kind of workflow that we're following. So the part that we're gonna copy over here is our little summary. We did it in sort of a sentence format. Down here, you could format it however you like with Markdown, but this is the little sentence that we want sort of a parallel to appear about our 2026 data. Now, if you're looking at your app views, let me come back in here, and you want to see where we defined something in our previous or in the notebook view, there's a handy little button. So I'm in my app view. I'm like, I want to go see the definition. What's the code that made this cell? There's a little handy button that says view in notebook. When you hover over, and when I hit view in notebook, it'll take me to my notebook view and it'll scroll to where I defined that cell specifically. I use this all the time, especially as my project gets a little bigger, super handy. All right, so same deal here. I'm gonna copy some of this code. First of all, I'm gonna copy my markdown. I'm gonna move it to the bottom down here, paste this in. All right, and then up above my markdown, I'm gonna copy that Python on down and update it for 2026. gonna come back on up here. All right, so it looks like I am referring to a few different variables in my original markdown. I'm using this variable country medalists, selected country, which is already the same. I don't need to redefine that. Total medalists and country medalist percent. All right, so these three variables I am gonna need to redefine for 2026. So I'm gonna copy all my definitions of those down and make some tweaks, all right? We'll start with our country medalists. I'm gonna bring that all the way on down, paste that into a new cell and follow my workflow. And my workflow is change the variable name. So I'm gonna add underscore 2026 or whatever makes sense to you. And then I'm gonna replace my medalist data with my medalist 2026 data set. So I'm just gonna replace my data set name in here, medalist 2026 and medalist 2026. I'm gonna double check the rest of this. So far, so good, great. And then I'm gonna change in my markdown where I used to have my variable country medalists. I'm gonna change this to country medalists to match my new variable name. So I'm gonna add that underscore 2026, run my code, and make sure that that works. Make sure that it's reading in my new variable. All right, so we're changing the variable name, changing the data frames you're pulling from, and then changing the variable that you're displaying in your markdown. You're gonna do that 2 more times, once for total medalists and once for country medalists percent. Okay, so you should scroll back up and find how we defined those in part 1, copy them on down, make some tweaks for 2026, and pop them in here. All right, I'm gonna give you all a couple minutes to do that. Make sure you get that to work. And we'll wave if you get stuck. All right, so when you're done with that, you should have 3 new variables related to 2026. I'm just gonna paste in what those should look like. All right, you've got these 3 variables that we had used in our previous little data summary: total medalist, country medalist percent. I've made a version of each of those variables for 2026. All right, that's why I've added my underscore 2026. I went ahead and copied their definitions on down from where we defined them for 2024. And then I'm just subbing in my 2026 data frames. All right, so here I've just sub medalist data for medalist 2026, same as I did for country medalists. And then for country medalist percent, for this value, I'm actually referring to these other 2 values that I've just defined, right? Total medalists and country medalists. So I'm referring to those new variables instead, my underscore 2026 and my underscore 2026. I'm keeping this math here, which is just a simple, division to get a percentage, keeping the math all the same. The only thing I'm changing is that variable name or that data frame name. All right, this is a very common thing to do, to just like switch out a data frame or a field name, something like that. I particularly find that if you're using AI, any sort of AI to like generate code, one of the most common things that it gets wrong is it like writes a correct piece of code, but it pulls it from the wrong data frame or it grabs the wrong column name. So even just knowing how you can go in and just swap out column name, swap out your data frame, super, super helpful. Lets you resolve a lot of quick errors that you might run into if you're using an assistant tool. Once you have those definitions updated, you can run that code and make sure that you update your references down here as well. Looks like I forgot to do that. So where it said total medalists, I'm just gonna update that with my underscore 2026. Same deal for my percentage field, underscore 2026. Run that and make sure that each of those populate in with a number. And then the last thing I'm going to do again is add this to my app, go check it over there and make sure everything all looks correct. So I'll hop over to my app view. Here's this new part that I've added in. I'm going to do a side by side. So I'm going to just do some drag and drop here to get this with 2024 on the left and 2026 on the right real quick. All right, so I'm going to drag this up. Maybe put it here, and then this is the new one I made. Drop it over here. All right, and then same thing, I'm just gonna test changing this to a different country. Let's look at Norway, for example. Okay, cool. And the thing I'm checking for here is that my values on the 2 sides are different, right? If it had said that Norway had 23 athletes winning medals on both of these sides, that would be a hint to me that I probably forgot to update my variable name. Like if I changed the country a few times and it was always the same number of athletes, that would be like a visual hint to me that I hadn't updated my variable name. But the number is different, the total is different, and the percentage is different. And I can also just do some mental like math to check that percentage, right? It makes sense. That means that all my variables are updated, looking good. Looks like Norway did very well in the 2026 Olympics, comparatively. All right, cool. All right, so let's take a look at where we are with our app. So we have our two different headings that we've added. We have our number of athletes for each set of Olympics with our little comparison on our 2026 side. We can't do the age, unfortunately. We just did our little summary, this little chunk at the bottom here. And then the last thing we want to add is our total medalists and gold medalists. So this is this component that we just added earlier for 2024. So again, we're going to pop in and add it for 2026. This should be starting to feel a little faster as we keep doing these, right? So what you're going to do is same workflow. Go back and look at where we defined the data for this component, copy it on down, make a version for 2026, update your markdown, and then add that on the right-hand side. All right, so same workflow. Again, I like to use my little handy find in notebook button, right? So when you hover right here, I can do view in notebook. I'm gonna pop over to that, double check how I defined this. Remember, this was when we did our top discipline and top gold discipline with our try except. So again, I'm going to copy these chunks of code down, copy this markdown down, update for 2026, excuse me, and add it to my app. All right, so do this along with you. Take my markdown, move it down here, take that new Python cell, come back up and copy this Python that we made earlier. Discipline and gold discipline, which is in our try except. So I'm going to copy this whole block. All right, down here. You can define these in different Python cells or in the same Python cell, totally up to you. Result is the same. Then I'm going to come in and update these guys. Now, one thing I'm going to notice right away is I don't have a country medalist for 2026. That was the data frame that we made for 2024. So I actually need one more line of code. If I come back up to where we defined our country medalists, I actually also need this line, update for 2026. Bring that down. All right, so my first step again is just copying down all this code I need to edit. Once I have all the code I need, I'm going to go through and replace any of those data frame variable names. So I'm adding underscore 2026 to all of these. It's good to do these all at once so you don't forget any. Same with medalist data, 26. Down here, also my references, 2026 and 2026. All right, once I've done all my updating, I will run my code, see if I get any errors. Okay, great, looks like it ran. It looks like if I check my markdown, looks like this is correct. My little try except is coming up with my little NA section, which is good. Looks like this, they did not have any golds. I'll hit add to app builder on the right-hand side of my new markdown section here. Same thing, I'll come back over to my app, do a little drag and drop to get it into a logical place. In this case, drop it over here. All right, looks like I made a little swap. I put skiing on the left-hand side, which is our Summer Olympics over here. Okay, cool. And so now I've got my Winter Olympics results on the right-hand side. I've got cross-country skiing, NA. And once again, I'm going to check my filter, try changing it to a different country and make sure everything updates on both sides correctly. All right, now it looks like this one got an error. Okay, so when I selected Mexico, looks like there were 5 athletes from Mexico, 0 athletes won medals, and then this component is giving me an error. So what that means is that while previously I had done my try except logic only for my gold medals, right? Because logically, when this was our only data set, we knew every country had at least one medal. Now it's possible that a country that won a medal in 2024 did not win any medals in 2026, which looks to be the case for Mexico. So we're getting an error here. I'm not going to go back through try except right now, but if you wanted to fix this, you would just apply that same try except logic to our 2026, our top discipline 2026 variable. Does that make sense? You do a try, do your line of code there, and then do an except and put in some sort of placeholder text. All right, we'll try some other country. Let's try Australia, for example. Cool, it looks like that works as expected. Okay, any questions about what we've got so far? Any errors? Feeling okay. All right, cool. We are making good progress. We're going to do one more sort of comparative component, which is going to involve updating our function that we created last time. So I'm just going to do a little review of our function before we get into this. I'm going to go back to my notebook view and come up here to our function, which is called medal color. Okay, this is a function that we walked through last time. You can tell it's a function in Python because it starts with DEF, which defines a function or a function definition. All right, what this function does is it takes an input, which is going to be a piece of text about the type of metal, and then it's going to return to you the little emoji that corresponds best with that metal, so gold, silver, bronze, or sad face if there is no metal. Okay, so this is the function that we used to apply to our data frame to get this column. Go back to my app view. This column in our little detail view that just has this little kind of visual icon for each of our rows. We got that by using this function. So we're going to apply that function to our 2026 data set so we can have a little side by side of our detail tables, just like this, just kind of continuing our side by side vision for our app. So I'm going to come back in here and same thing. I'm going to go back and look at the code that I used for my 2024 details table. All right, scroll around in here. All right, great. So let's work backwards through this code that creates this table. It's pulling from something called Medalist Display View. I'll look one cell up, which is where I define Medalist Display View. If I take a look at this code, this first section should look familiar. This is filtering my medalist data by the country, right? We've seen this filter a bunch of times. The next thing that it's doing, we saw this last time, is selecting only a specific list of columns. So we only want to display these 4 columns in our finished app, even though there's a whole bunch of columns in this data set. So we're just giving it the list of the specific columns we want to display in this case. And the last thing we're doing is applying a sort values so that they're sorted by name. We could also sort them by discipline or event or whatever, but we decided to sort by name. All right, so this is the chunk of code that we used to display in our app. Notably, one of the columns we selected is called metal emoji. Now I know for a fact that that column does not exist in my 2026 data set. So I need to remember how we added that column last time. So I'm going to scroll back on up one more time in my previous code here to figure out where I added that column. I know I added it here in this line because this column name is on the left-hand side of my equal sign. That means I've made up this column right here in this cell and then assigned some data to it on the right-hand side. The data that I've assigned to this column is applying our metal color function all the way down that data frame. So what this dot apply means is it means take this function, in this case metal color, and for every single row in our medalist data frame, run the function on the metal type value. So if the metal type is bronze, spit out the bronze emoji. Next row down, metal is silver, spit out the silver emoji, etc., all the way down. Okay. So again, this is the chunk of code that I'm going to need to copy for 2026. So I'm going to start here with this kind of earliest line that I need. I'm going to copy this on down to a new Python cell, and I'm going to do my same updates. All right, so I don't want to interact with my 2024 data frame. So I'm going to replace this with the name of my 2026 data frame. And let me go check what the column name is here. Right now, it looks like this column name might be different. Now, I might have checked the column name or I might have forgotten to look. If you forget to look, you'll get an error like this. Okay, again, scroll on down to the very last line of your error anytime you have an error. Key error metal type. All right, so it was looking for something called metal type. It didn't find it. I will figure that out if I go look in my data browser over here. I'll notice that from 2024, my medalist data set had a column called type. In 2026, it doesn't for some reason. It's just called metal or metal code. This is, again, very common thing you might run into. I might want to look at some samples of my data here to figure out which of those I should use. So again, I would just do .head on my data frame real quick. Looks like metal code is the number, but metal is actually the description of what it is. Great, so instead of metal type in my line of code that I pasted up here, I'll just use metal, because that's how the column is labeled. Okay, so I will run that. It's gonna rerun my .head down below, and I'll see that it's added for me this column metal emoji, which is great. Next though, I'm gonna look at the values in that metal emoji column, and it looks like every single one of these says sad face, okay? Meaning it's not returning that little gold, silver, bronze for these metals. So let's go figure out why that is. When we look at our metal column for 2026, It's this value gold in all caps, silver in all caps, bronze in all caps. And if I scroll back up and look at my function definition back up in here, this function is checking if the metal type exactly matches the phrase gold medal. And if so, it returns that gold emoji. Right now, from my looking at my data frame there, I noticed that it's not going to say gold medal. It's actually going to say gold in all caps in 2026. For some reason, that format is slightly different, which means my formula or my function here isn't working super well, right? It's checking this if, it's saying, well, that's false. It's checking this if, that's false. Checking this if, that's false. So it's coming down to sort of our fallback option here, which is our sad face. That's not what we want. Obviously, intuitively, we know we want it to return this top one. So we actually need to tweak our function a little bit. Right now, our function only works for 2024 data because of the formatting. We want our function to work for both data sets. And ideally, we want it to work for any future data sets that we might use as well. Okay. So what we are going to do is change the way that we're checking this if logic in our function. So instead of checking for this exact phrase with this exact capitalization, which is what this logic is doing, we're just going to say if the metal input that you get has the word gold in it, we're going to give you this gold emoji. So we're going to make this a little more flexible so it's not dependent on this exact spelling. All right, I gave you the little line to do that in our little tutorial here. I'm going to copy that in from here on down. Okay, so I'm going to change my if line in our function. I'm going to change that first if line, which currently says if equals gold medal, to this if line. Okay, so I'm going to come back into my function. So you should scroll back up in your file. And we're going to replace line 2 here of our defined function with, I'm going to copy paste this in with this line. What is this line doing? This is saying, take whatever input you were given, make it all lowercase, and see if the phrase or the sequence of letters GOLD appears anywhere in that input. If it does, give us this gold medal emoji. So see, that's a little bit more flexible than what we had before, where it was like exactly matching a string. So now that I've updated my function, just this one line so far, I'm going to run this cell so it updates my function throughout the rest of my project. And I'm going to scroll on down to where I was getting the whole column of sad faces before, which is down here. And now, because it's all rerun, if I scroll back over in my preview, I'll see that my gold medal row actually has the correct emoji filled in, and my silver and bronze still have the kind of sad face showing up. All right, so that's a good signal to me that that logic update I made in my function worked, and I should make that similar update for the silver and bronze logic. All right, so I'm going to scroll back up to my function now that I've checked that it works. All right, and you should change lines 4 and 6 so that they're the same format as line 2. All right, so we're going to want to copy line 2 down and swap in for gold to make sure that our function works for gold, silver, and bronze, regardless of exactly how that column is formatted. All right, so make lines 4 and 6 look like line 2 in your function. Hit run and go on all the way down and make sure that that worked. Give you all a moment to try that. Give me a wave if you get stuck. So when you're done with that, it should look something like this. Just pasted this logic down and replaced this one with the word silver, this one with the word bronze, right? I'll run that cell and then I'll check all the way down to my 2026 data frame, check that right-hand column and make sure that those little emojis are coming through correctly for all my different types of metals. All right. Anyone have any trouble with their function? Anyone not getting this in their 2026 column? Okay, cool. All right, and then we're going to kind of finish out our copying of this element. Remember, we're copying over that details table, that the sort of display view that we made before. So what I'm going to do here is copy these other 2 pieces of logic. The first one is applying our metal color data frame and making sure we're saving that to a column. I think I copied that part earlier, so let's go on down and check. Yep, this is the part I already copied, right? So I'm adding this column to my 2026 data frame. So the very last step that I need to copy down is the part where I just filter it to those 4 columns that I want to display. I did that here in this line, so I'm going to go up and find this. I'm going to copy this guy, come all the way on down, and paste it in a new cell down here. And then same deal, I'm going to update these all for 2026. So I'm going to update my variable name for 2026. Make sure my data frames are updated. Great. Looks like I can probably keep all this other logic the same. Sure that runs. I've got some sort of error here. All right, so when I get my error, I'm gonna come in and check the bottom. It says key error event, not in index. Let's look at my 2026 data. And it looks like in my 2026 data set, this column is called event name instead of event. It's a sort of annoying thing that happens all the time in these sorts of projects. But luckily that's an easy fix. I'm just going to edit this line of code here where I tried to refer to the event column, update this name to match. So it's event name, and boom, that gets rid of my error. Okay. Now what I did before was a table display cell. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to add a cell of type table up in here. And then I'm going to make sure I select that display view 2026 that I just made. All right, it'll probably auto select it for you if you do it in the cell right below. But otherwise you can come in this drop down and make sure it's selecting the right data frame to display. All right, and you should see their emoji, their name, their discipline, and their event. All right, and then same thing, I'm gonna add to my app builder. Go to my app builder, drag this to the left and right hand sides. Let's see, so I'll take my table from last time, pop it left, and I'll take my table from this time. Just gonna drag this up, pop it on the right. Okay, collapse my little data browser so we can see a little better. First thing I'm just gonna visually check is that my numbers are matching, right? So 123 from the summer, 6 from the winter. I'll just do a quick scroll down and make sure that looks like that matches. Looking good. Something else you'll notice in your app view, you'll see at the bottom of these detail tables the number of rows, which is super helpful for your own check. And also you'll see this little download icon. That means that the end user of your app can apply some filters and then they can download, say, a CSV or a spreadsheet of this little filter data set for themselves to use. So that's always a good thing to think about if you want, and people who are using your data app, to download their results for any reason, including a little display element is a good way to let them do that. All right, so again, just a little dragging and dropping to get this organized into my 2 columns. So we are getting very close. Oh, where's my final demo? Okay, we're getting very close to our finished app. We have one very exciting component to add in, which is our map component. So this is a heat map. And what we were going to have this do is show for each of those Olympics how many medalists were from each country. And when we hover over, we can see the name of that country and how many medals were awarded to that country on each side, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that is the last component that we are going to add to our app, is this heat map. Okay, so we're going to do a couple of things here. First thing that we're going to do is just a quick concept check that this component is actually not going to react to my filter in my app, right? This component is just going to show the whole world map all the time. And then all these other components that we've made are the ones that react to my filter. So I'm not actually going to worry about that selected country variable as we create our map. This is just going to be to show all those countries. So someone could sort of mouse around like this, say, I wonder what Sweden won, and then come down and filter from there. So just from a app design perspective, I'm going to put this component up above that filter since it's unrelated to our filtering. Okay. Because it's unrelated to our filtering, I need to do a little bit of my own kind of sort of a different sort of munging or updating this data so that it'll work in my app. Specifically, I'm going to need a data set that'll just show me for each country one row that has that country and their number of medals, because that's what I want to display here. So we need to create that summary. I've given you a little code snippet to do that here. So you should run that in a new Python cell. Take that on down here and talk a little bit about what it's doing. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is take my medalist data frame, apply a group by, which we've talked about before. That just means I want to summarize by a specific column, in this case, my country, right? Because that's the level I want my heat map to display. Dot size we used before when we were counting athletes. We want to figure out just how many medalists there are per country. We can use dot size because we're already starting with our medalist data set, right? So we know that every row in that data set has a medal. So we don't need to filter further by like, did they win or not? Okay. We're going to add this little thing called toFrame. This is just going to give that column with the size a column name, right? If we just do dot size, it's just a blank header. There's no way to refer to that column. So toFrame is just adding a little label onto that counting column that we're making. And then we're going to add dot reset index, which is just a handy little pandas trick, which will make our sort of, it'll kind of force our data frame to be interpreted as a fresh set of row numbers. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I take this off and I've just run my group by, I've run my size, and I've run my to frame number metals, I've got my data here, but it's not quite interpreting it as a data frame yet. So you'll commonly see in pandas when you're making a new data frame or doing some summary, this dot reset index. You'll notice the change it makes in my preview view is it's just giving a little row number 0, 1, 2, 3 to each of these. It's forcing Python to just interpret this as a data frame. Okay, I don't want to get too deep into the technical, but you will see this a lot in pandas. It's generally just kind of like a cleanup step anytime you're creating a new data frame. It often helps. Okay, and then I'm just saving this to my variable names. In this case, I'm just going to call this something like country summary 2024. So I'm going to put that with my equal sign in front of this little chunk of code, run that again. My preview will disappear, but I'll know it's saved to this variable that's turned green. Okay, great. And then I'm going to do the same thing for 2026. All right, so you should create a country summary 2026 in the same way. So again, I'll pop down here. I can do this in the same cell or a different cell, but I want to change my variable name and I want to change my data frame that I'm pulling. All right, run that, make sure I don't get any errors. Since I've done this in the same cell, it's going to show me two different little green highlighted bits here that tell me about those two new data frames, and I can check in my data browser and make sure that they're showing up. My new country summary tables. I can also just kind of check that my group by worked by checking the number of rows. This it should be a smaller number of rows, right, than my whole meta list table. So I'm just checking in my data browser here that that makes some intuitive sense. Okay. All right, so this is the fun part. Now we get to add our map. This is a built-in thing to Hex as well as a bunch of other visualization tools, and it's actually going to be able to recognize our data just based on that country name column. All right, so to do this, we are going to, down below where you've defined these two data frames, you're going to add a new cell component called map in here. So I'm going to add a map, and I'm going to tell it that I want to pull from, we'll do 2024 first, and we'll make another one of these for 2026. I want my type to be area, right? I want the whole country to be highlighted, and it's going to just let me tell it which column that location data is stored in. So under column, I'm going to select country. And then under region, this is the different ways that it can interpret the data in the column that I gave it. So in this case, I just want it to be countries and then name of the country. Looks like it accepts a variety of abbreviations. I think some of these are those 3-letter abbreviations that we used in code to country earlier. We're just going to go ahead and use country name because that's already what our whole app is sort of based on. All right, and you can see right away, it's created a little map and it's filled in all those countries that we have data for in that 2024 summary data set, which is pretty cool. Next thing that we're going to do is make it a heat map, right? Right now it's doing a single color fill, meaning it's making all those map areas the same color. We actually want it to color in based on how many medals that country won in the Olympics. So we're going to change single color to say color based on data, and then tell it which column to go look at to set the color. In this case, that's our number of medals column. And so it'll set it to a different shade of blue based on how many medals, more medals, the darker blue. You can also click on this color palette and change this to a different palette of colors if you like. Maybe I'll change it to green for this one. All right, cool. And then the very last thing I like to do that makes your app really fun and interactive for your end user is to make sure you add a tooltip. Tooltip is the thing that shows up when you roll your mouse over that part of the image. So the more interesting information you can put in there for your end user, the more interactive and engaging it is. So down here under tooltip, under fields, I like to throw in as many fields as you can here. In this case, just the 2 that we have. And that means that when you roll your mouse over, you can see that China had 168 medals, etc. So it's kind of a cool little bit for your end user. All right. I also want to give this a little label. So up here in the left-hand corner of my cell, I can label my cell, and that label will show up in my finished app. So I might label this something like 2024 medalists map or something like that. And then I will, same thing, hit the add to app builder button on the right of this component, hop over to my app. It's probably gonna stick it at the bottom somewhere. Great, and now I see my component here, and same thing, I can drag it up. I'm gonna drag it up above my filter because again, it's not reacting to my filter. Sometimes when you drag and drop, it sometimes gets a little funky, but if you scroll around on it, it like realigns the shapes, just a little quirky. Realign the shapes, and I can also here scroll in. So I'm just kind of like zooming in on my keyboard. Let's say I want it to zoom in over here. And so when people first land on my app, maybe you want it to show that full world view, maybe you want it to be zoomed in on a certain region, you can hit this little pin button, which will set a default start position. So that anytime a new user opens up your app for the first time, it'll see the map zoomed into a specific area. So that's optional, totally up to you. If you have a favorite country that you're rooting for, you could zoom it in around that country, for example. All right, so that is our 2024 medalist map. We are going to do the same thing with, I'll come back to my notebook here, same thing with our 2026 summary. So you can either come down here and add another map component and enter all those settings the way we just did. You can also, on the right-hand side of this one we just created, hit our little dot, dot, dot icon here, hit duplicate, which will copy this cell right on down below with all that same configuration. And then you can change the data source in the tops. Make sure I get the right thing, country summary 2026. Take a second to rerun. Sometimes it gets the column names here, sometimes it does not. So you might have to click on the stuff again if it didn't pick it up. Color based on data, yes, but I got to remind it to do it from metals. All right, and then I'm going to fix my tooltip here. So duplicate copies some of the settings, but not all of them. All right, but I'm just clicking on the same stuff. Maybe I'll do a blue fill-in for the Winter Olympics. That feels slightly winterier to me. I'll change this little label to something 2026 related, 2026 medal lists maps, something like this. And I'll hit my add to app builder. You know what's coming next. Go to my app, come on down here, find my new one. I'm going to drag these up side by side. You could do any layout you like. I just got a little side by side thing going on here. All right, and I'll collapse this. Okay, and now if I scroll on down, these are all the components that I want in my app. So we weren't able to copy the age one for 2026. Maybe I'll kind of leave that one at the bottom since it makes me a little unsymmetrical up here. Okay, but I can make any other changes you want to your drag and drop. I can make this go all the way across if I wanted. Make these different widths, put these in a different order, right? I can just like drag and drop anything wherever I want to. All right, once you're happy with your layout, we're going to do the same kind of publishing steps that we did last time. So once you're all done with everything how you like it, you can come up to the top of your app. So I've zoomed in on the Atlantic Ocean. Come up to the top. You can also change this little description line of text here. So maybe I'll call this my awesome app. Put whatever you like there. And then you're going to hit publish app. So even if you were here in part one and you've already published your app, any changes you've made today won't show up for your end user in that sort of app view, unless they're like a co-editor on your project, which is not something we've covered in the scope of this class. They won't see your changes until you actually publish that. So you're going to go in and publish. What it does when you come to publish mode is it's going to run through all your cells and check that nothing returns an error. So if you have any errors, you can't publish. So it's going to run and make sure you don't have any errors. It's going to give you a little box to put in any notes about what you changed. If you're going to be working on a project for a long time, this is nice. I might put in something like added 2026 components, some little note to yourself, or to your collaborators if you're working with some collaborators. Sometimes this takes a minute because it runs every single cell all the way down your app to check for errors. But once it runs everything, it'll give you this green publish app button. So you should, once that button turns green, you can hit that button. And this is the cool part. If you were here in part one, you might have already done this, but you can hit share and you can share the app with anyone with the link, which is very cool. So this is a good way to share projects publicly. If you want to include a project in your portfolio, I can say anyone with the link can view the app. That's what I might set it to here. I can copy this app link. So this in this case is my published app. I can open that up in a new tab just to see what my like end user would see. Don't think for a second. So this is what my end user would see out here on the, if I had this link posted on, my portfolio, the public internet, they would see this. They can come in and interact with all these components. They can zoom in on this map. They can hover over and see these tooltips that we've put in. They can come down here and change this filter. In your published app, this filter will stay as whatever you set it in your editor view. So if you want it to start on a specific country, you should set that before you publish it. But I could come in as an end user, change this drop down. I'll see it loading in the upper right hand side for a second, and then it'll go through and update all of my components. And as you can see, I have this option to download my data if I want. So as your end user could copy this little data set and do their own analysis with it, for example. All right, we covered a lot of components today. We added obviously a visual component with this map piece. You can also add all the traditional sort of graphs with these similar kind of visualization components. So if you go to add a cell, you can see all the options. We use a lot of these, but not all of them. So for example, chart, you can create a line chart or a scatter plot, bar chart, all of the standard kind of chart types. We've done a bunch of markdown cells. We did a bunch of Python cells. We did single value, we did table, we did drop down, we did map. So we used a lot of these, but obviously there are more you can add. Cool. Okay, the very last thing I will say, I have our little like course website thing for you here too, which this is that too. So I have some more links in here. This white button at the bottom has some more links, just stuff that I like for learning Python, just continuing to learn more data skills, specifically Hex as a tool. I really like it. Is really similar to other visualization tools. If there's something else that you want to use or learn, you should find it pretty similar. And the Hex website also has some pretty good tutorials and content on it as well that I would recommend. Okay, so you can find any sort of links stuff on there that you want to take a look at. This page will stay up as well if you want to like review this later. And the Digital Lounge publishes the recordings of these sessions on the annenbergdl.org site in case you want to run through refresher